If you're a woodworker, you know one of the most important things that you can do well is sanding. And in this video, I want to give you 3 big mistakes that you need to avoid as you get busier, as you get more and more projects, and you're going to be sanding more and more. Let's dive in. What is up, you guys? Welcome back to the podcast. Welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Zach Vaught, and I hope that these episodes are helping you on your journey of growing or scaling your custom furniture or woodworking or cabinetry business. And in today's video, I want to walk you through the big 3 sanding mistakes that you need to avoid as you get busier, as you are trying to get more efficient, as you're trying to continually improve upon the product that you're making. Let's dive in. Number 1. The first big problem that a lot of guys make is that they skip too many grits too fast. And so they might make their first pass with 80 grit, and then they jump to 180 grit or 220 grit or 250 grit or something like that. And what that actually does, with 80 grit, I'm taking off more material and I'm leaving deeper grooves with the sandpaper. I need to make incremental jumps to like 100 or 120 next, so that I can take out those bigger grooves with the next pass. If I make too big of a jump to say 180 or 220, well, that grit isn't gritty enough to actually take out the sanding marks from the 80 grit sandpaper. Ultimately, what that's going to leave you with is a bunch of sanding marks in your project, and as soon as you hit that puppy with stain, you're going to see it. It's going to show up. You're going to be able to see it all over the place, right? So we want to instead work through a sequence. And so in my own woodworking business, we had 2 sanders. And so we had a 6-inch Bosch gear-driven sander that took off a lot of material. And so we would start with that with 80 grit. And so it was a really aggressive sander. We would sand it with 80 grit. And then we would put 120 grit on that same sander and go over the material again. Then we would go to 120 grit with a 5-inch palm sander, a random orbital sander. So we'd go 80, 120, 120, but we'd go from 80 aggressive, 120 aggressive to 120 with a random orbital sander. And that would always give us a consistent and clean finish. Then we're applying stain, or we're applying, 2 to 3 coats of lacquer. And we really didn't need to sand up above 120 as long as we're applying lacquer, because after I've applied lacquer 2 or 3 times, I'm actually not touching the wood. I'm touching the lacquer coat on top of it, right? But that's one of the biggest mistakes that I see guys making, is they're jumping too many grits too quickly. Okay, here's the second mistake that a lot of people are making, is that they're using worn out sandpaper for too long. And so one of the big problems with this is that when you're sanding with the same piece of sandpaper for too long, number 1, that sandpaper is getting worn down, so it's not working the same way that a fresh piece of sandpaper would. And number 2 is that any impurities in the wood, anything on the wood, sawdust is getting stuck in the sandpaper, and that is also causing imperfections in your finish. If you have dull paper, it's going to cause burns, swirl marks, and it's going to eventually just result in wasted effort, and you're going to have to come back and redo all the stuff that you've already done. The number 1 thing I can tell you here is that you need to just be swapping your sandpaper on a somewhat regular basis during a sanding job, or making sure that you're taking a blower and blowing out your sandpaper as you're going. And so you need to keep an eye on how effective is this piece of sandpaper working, and you'll notice when it's lost its effectiveness, right? If I was sanding before and I felt like a lot of material was coming off, and 30 minutes later I'm still sanding with that piece of sandpaper, I'm going to notice that not as much material is coming off, it's probably time to swap, or it's time to clean it out, one or the other. And so here's mistake number 3, and this is probably the most important one, if I can be honest with you, and that is not checking your work in really good lighting. I cannot tell you how many times we have sanded a workpiece, felt like, man, we did this right, this is going to be perfect, we're ready for stain. And as soon as we put stain on this raw piece of wood, it exposes all of our sanding mistakes that we made. And if you're doing a 10-foot table, for example, and you thought you sanded it perfect and you've got swirl marks all in it, you've got to strip all that stain off again and resand it, okay? Which just added an additional 2 or 3 hours of labor to that project. And the biggest thing that it cost you was a bunch of frustration, and it's going to also cost you a lot of pieces of sandpaper, because as you start sanding that fresh stain off, it's going to clog up your sandpaper, and you're going to have to replace it over and over and over and over and over and over and over. This is one of the biggest mistakes that everybody makes. This is not just a beginner mistake. Even in the height of my business, my team would still do this, because we would not check in really good lighting our workpiece before we moved on. And what you need to do is you actually need to have a flashlight, or you need to have a bar light that you're looking over every inch of this workpiece and feeling extremely confident that you are ready before you apply stain. Once you apply stain and you got to strip that stain off, it's going to demoralize you or your team. And so make sure that you're using a flashlight across the surface before you start applying finish. You start applying stain, applying finish to the product. The main thing I want to just harp on here is that sanding is one of those things that if you screw it up and you got to come back and redo it, it eats away at your profits and it eats away at your morale, okay? It's one of the biggest kicks in the head as a woodworker that you're going to encounter. And so with that, make sure that you are slowing down. One of the things I always say is there's times to go fast and there's times to go slow. When you're sanding, you should not try to speed through sanding. If you're sanding like this, you're going to get swirl marks. You should let the sander do the work, move nice and slow, and work your way around the workpiece, okay? And so with that, if you've got anything that you've done that has helped you get more efficient with sanding, help you prevent mistakes with sanding, or if there's any other big mistakes that you've made while sanding, I would love to hear it in the comment section below. I'd love to hear your feedback on this video. And so if this is helpful to you, be sure to like and subscribe, and also be sure to check out the resources that we have in the description below as well. So with that, love and appreciate you guys, and I'll see you all in the next one.